Jesus, it will give us greater courage and hope. That's what we're told in verse 6. It will strengthen our courage, and it will give us hope to live this faith, persecution or not, so long as God gives us breath. And that's a great way to live. Does anyone here want to be a prevailing Christian? You guys look skeptical. Maybe you're wondering, well, what's a prevailing Christian? It's not a term we use much. As far as I'm concerned, the word prevail is one of the greatest words in the English language. To prevail means to be or become greater in strength and influence. To be or become effective. In a word, to prevail is to triumph. Does anyone want to be a prevailing Christian? Raise your hand. All right, there's a few hands going up now. Earlier this week, I had dinner with one of our board members, and he had mentioned that he was just listening to CBC radio, and they had an interview with a bishop from the Anglican Church in Canada. And during the interview, the bishop declared, and this is a direct quote from this board member, "This generation being born today will see the death of the Christian religion, not only in Canada, but worldwide." And then after making that hopeless declaration, this bishop went on to decry all of the problems with the Christian faith. And don't even get me started. I'm here to say that at River City Church we have a different view. We plan to be a prevailing church. A church that over time increases in strength and influence. A church that over time increases in effectiveness. In a word, we plan to be a church that triumphs. And we are committed to growing, prevailing followers of Jesus Christ. And before I go on to verse 7, just mention that there's a major transition in our passage now. The first 6 verses are this comparison and contrast between Jesus and Moses. And then in verse 7, the writer does something politically incorrect. The writer talks about the consequences of refusing to believe in Jesus. And again, in an effort to connect with this predominantly Jewish audience, the writer does something really wise. He quotes the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11 are an exact mirror of Hebrews 3, 7 through 11. So let me read it. "So, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion during the time of testing in the desert, where your fathers tested and tried me, and for 40 years saw what I did. That's why I was angry with that generation, and I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest." And what this psalm does, what this quote does, is it summarizes the inglorious history of the Jews under Moses' leadership. Moses may have fulfilled his calling from God, but he did it with lots of opposition from the Jewish people. The people that he was called to lead didn't make it easy for him. He led them to the edge of the promised land, but the people refused to enter. Why? For those of you who know a little bit about the Bible know that the reason that they didn't want to enter the promised land was because the people that lived there were giants. They were large, and they had well-fortified cities, so they were intimidated by the army and the strength of their opponents. And so they refused to enter. They refused to accept God at face value. They refused His promise of provision and help and protection as they entered the land. They ignored the signs and the wonders that God had performed just so recently in their midst. And maybe you're wondering, as I wondered when I first read this, well, how can they do that? They've seen the plagues in Egypt. They've been led through the sea on dry ground. They've received the 10 Commandments from Moses at the hand of God. And they've gotten water from a rock and birds for meat from the air. And God has led them safely through this desert. They're at the edge of the promised land. They've seen the power of God. But they still will not enter. How can they be so untrusting? How can we be so untrusting? The answer is in verse 8. They allowed their hearts to become hardened. The people allowed their hearts to harden. A hard heart is a stubborn heart. Just like a loaf of bread that's dried and crumbly has no use, we throw it out, So too, a hard heart is one that cannot be restored in any way, no matter what. And it can happen to anyone. It can happen just as easily to us today as it happened to the people during the Exodus. And the good news is, if you're worried that your heart's going to become hard instantaneously, it doesn't. It usually happens over time. Basically, a person's heart becomes hard as a result of making a series of choices that disregard God's will. A series of choices that push God out of your life, out of your heart. And if you resist God long enough, if you push Him out long enough, then eventually you'll become utterly lost. You will become utterly lost. And in verses 12 and 13, the writer applies that history that I just talked about of refusing to trust God. He applies it to his audience in the New Testament. Hebrews 12 and 13. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. Now what the writer's doing here is he's sounding the alarm. He's saying, don't be like them. Don't let happen to you what happened to them. Instead, encourage each other, and if you need to, do it every day. How do you keep a loaf of bread from becoming hard? Well, you prolong its life by putting it in a bag and maybe putting it in the freezer. How do you keep your heart from growing hard? Well, you stay in relationship with other believers. You encourage one another daily. You share your struggles. And finally, you need to be willing and ready to sound the alarm. To sound the alarm about sin's deceitfulness. That's a direct quote from verse 13. And I find it interesting that sin, right, is personified here. It's given people-like qualities. Beware of sin's deceitfulness. I don't know what picture you get when I read that phrase, but here's the picture that I get. If you've watched the children's classic Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, you'll recognize it. Sin attracts us like little children to yummy candy, and then it snatches us and it throws us in a prison. And the stronger the Christian community that you surround yourself with, the closer that you side up to other followers of Jesus Christ, the lesser your chances of getting caught by sin's deceitfulness. And this is an idea that is so countercultural, but it is so incredibly biblical. The Christian life was never meant to be lived as an individual in isolation. It was meant to be lived communally, in fellowship with other people. And that's the first time in the book of Hebrews where we're told to encourage one another, but that's a theme that's going to come up a little bit later. I think it's going to come up in the week that Kevin is speaking in a few weeks. If you're holding to the Christian faith apart from a band of brothers, apart from a band of sisters, who will A, encourage you daily, and B, warn you when you're being deceived, you do so at peril to your faith. At great peril to your faith. And that's not just me saying that, it's the writer of Hebrews saying it, and it's even more. In the last few verses, the writer reveals that that's what history reveals as well. I'm just going to read the last 5 verses or so of this chapter. As has just been said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as you did in the rebellion. Who were they who heard and rebelled? Were they not all those Moses led out of Egypt? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the desert? And to whom did God swear that they would never enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed? So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. And so an entire generation failed to receive God's best in them. And that's recorded directly in history. And what the writer here is saying is there are consequences for refusing to believe in God's Son, Jesus Christ. There are consequences for believing or refusing to believe God at face value and for failing to take him at his word.